Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming through. My name's Dylan Rodriguez. I'm here in my capacity as co-director of the Center for Ideas and Society. I'm a distinguished professor at UC Riverside in the Department of Black Study and the Department of Media and Cultural Studies. It is an absolute privilege to welcome you to our keynote plenary panel for our annual conference. This panel is titled Collective Sustenance, Nourishment in a Depleted World. So folks, please know that the event is now being recorded for potential posting on the Center for Ideas and Society YouTube channel. You should have access to captions available on your Zoom interface. We are in a webinar format, so please feel free to make use of the Q&A function to post any thoughts or notes or discussion questions as we move into that period at the latter end of this event. Many universities, as you all know, that have inherited the spoils of colonialism and the trafficking of captive enslaved people routinely introduce campus events with official sanctioned land acknowledgements. So I will not be participating in that practice today. I join what I think is a growing community of colleagues, scholars, students, workers at these institutions who reject those institutionalized versions of the university land acknowledgement because we increasingly experience it as a normalization and legitimation of ongoing colonial power and violence. I, along with many of you, reject this. So instead, I hope you'll allow me to welcome you to the event in the spirit of collective activation rather than passive acknowledgement. Perhaps our time together, especially in a discussion and panel like this, I hope will further inform and inspire us to cultivate forms of study, creativity, relation, and community that will actually eliminate the need for colonial land acknowledgements at the University of California and elsewhere. UC Riverside is a settler colonial institution that occupies unceded land and ecologies continuously inhabited by the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples on and around the campus. In the spirit of this inhabitation, I invoke the shared life work of Rupert and Jeanette Costo, who devoted themselves to reclaiming, protecting, and sustaining Indigenous presence at UC Riverside. Their legacies, including the co-founding of the American Indian Historical Society and the Indian Historian Press, serve as a constant reminder that Indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nations peoples from all over the world are students and workers at this campus. I continue by honoring Taisha Miller, whose 19-year-old soul was stolen by the Riverside Police Department while unconscious in her car just a few blocks from the UC Riverside campus in 1998. Her absence is a permanent testament to the centrality of anti-Black state violence to this institution and the surrounding geography. I honor the lives and spirits of those seeking relief from the decrepit, extraordinary conditions of carceral torture at the California State Prison in Norco, about 20 minutes from the campus, where UC Riverside, proudly and unironically runs an accredited college education program. I honor the lives and spirits lost under the supervision of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, with which UC Riverside has a cooperating police relationship. Finally, I honor the lives and spirits of coworkers, students, and surrounding community members who have experienced and continue to experience harassment, intimidation, surveillance, profiling, and criminalization by the University of California's police departments, as well as its administrators, including and especially members of the UC Board of Regents. I humbly offer these words as a reminder of the conditions surrounding the space of today's precious plenary panel. I'm honored and privileged to welcome you by calling forward new, old, collective, and experimental efforts to create decolonized abolitionist and liberated futures. Welcome, everybody. I now have the pleasure of introducing Professor Dana Simmons. Dana Simmons is an interdisciplinary historian whose research engages with questions of basic needs, minimum wages, minimum standards of living, hunger, and starvation. Her work draws from science and technology studies, history of science, feminist studies, food studies, critical theory, and labor history to examine how politics is scientized and how science is weaponized in the service of class, racial, and gendered violence. Dana is the author of 2 books, Vital Minimum, Need, Science, and Politics in Modern France, and most recently, On Hunger, Violence and Craving in America from Starvation to Ozempic. On Hunger addresses the production of hunger, showing how hunger was produced and directed towards specific ends, learning, labor, compliance, control, and consumption, and argues that hunger served as an instrument to consolidate the modern United States. I'm truly, truly thrilled to announce here that this book was just awarded the Emory Elliott Book Award from the Center for Ideas and Society for the book for the current year. This is an honor that recognizes the breadth and intellectual generosity of Dana's work. And I will also say I'm really proud to call Dana a collaborator, a friend, a comrade, much more than a colleague. I'm going to pass it to Dana. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Dylan, for the beautiful introduction and framing and situating and bringing us all here in every sense of the word. I'm really honored to be in the company of this panel, whose panelists whose work I admire enormously and who I also have wonderful associations with in various ways. And I will just say that any day, I don't know how many of you were there at the 9 a.m. start to this conference, but any day that begins with a recipe for human meatballs in hot pot with daikon radish is going to be a really interesting day. So we're already well started. I have the enormous pleasure of introducing the three panelists for our keynote event today. Also, but before I do that, I do want to thank the Center for Ideas and Society, in particular, Catherine Henshaw and Bianca Lopez for your incredible support and for making this event possible. The center and Dylan and co-director really sustain us as faculty and graduate students and workers on campus. So I'm just really grateful to the center for existing. So I'll turn now to introducing the three panelists, and the plan for us is for each of the panelists to speak for about 5 minutes, just unspooling associations around the conference theme of sustenance. And then we'll turn to a kind of question-driven conversation. And I hope that those of you who are attending this panel will feel free to intervene in the Q&A function of the webinar as we move along, and we'll try and integrate your thoughts, your questions in the flow of the conversation, as opposed to kind of waiting. We will keep some space at the end of this session for audience-driven conversations, but I also really want to encourage you to become part of the discussion as we go along. So with that, our three panelists, starting with Catherine. Catherine Sameh is Associate Professor and Chair of Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of California, Irvine, down the road. Her research takes up questions of gender and feminism in Iran and the diaspora. So central right now. I've been thinking of you a lot, actually, Catherine, over the past few weeks, and how intense it must be right now. Also, social movements in the Middle East, Islam, human rights, and transnational feminist networks. She's the author of Axis of Hope, Iranian Women's Rights Activism Across Borders, which was published by the University of Washington Press in 2019. Next, we have Vetri Nathan, who is Associate Professor in the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies at UCLA. He's the founder and director of the Multi-Species Future Lab. His forthcoming book project, entitled Our Multi-Species Futures, Control, Care, and Kinship in a Transformed World, will be out in fall of 2026 with the University of Exeter Press. And it proposes a new multi-species framework for research, teaching, and community building in the post-humanities. And I'm super excited to discuss this framing with you, Vetri. And then finally, super happy to have with us Paulina Liu, who is Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow in American Studies at UC Davis. She earned her PhD in American Studies from NYU in 2025. An interdisciplinary ethnographer of food in the body, her current book project about edible insects and future food imaginaries focuses on the motivations and feelings that surround the work of developing new food systems and on the different kinds of relationships that people form with and through insects in the process of making them into and consuming them as food. How cool is that? Her writing can be found in Agriculture and Human Values, Public Books, GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies, Food, Culture, and Society, and in the forthcoming edited collection, Culinaria, Women of Color Rewriting Our Food Stories, which is coming out in this summer from SUNY Press. So you already have several books now on your list to pre-order. So I will now open it up to the three of you to begin the conversation, to start building up our collective realm of associations for us to discuss. And we'll start with Catherine.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, especially to Dana for the invitation, but also to Catherine, Bianca, Dylan, the Center for Ideas in Society at UCR. It's such a wonderful opportunity to engage this amazing theme of sustenance. And I wasn't able to attend any of the other sessions, but I read the abstracts, which were deeply compelling. And I was struck by, all of the abstracts, but certain terms that resonate with the ways in which I've been thinking with questions of food and other reproductive labor. So embodied life, transnational family life, collective care against alienation. I'm really interested in food as a portal into local, regional, and global economic, environmental, and political crises, as well as an engine powering the material and affective realms of desire, pleasure, longing, community, joy, meaningful labor, and life making. As we know, the production, circulation, consumption, and multiple meanings of food are shaped by histories of slavery, colonialism, immigration, as well as climate, health, and economic crises, and ongoing struggles over gendered and racialized divisions of reproductive labor. So, food is certainly a dynamic vector for power and resistance. Thinking with food and other forms of labor and care tied to sustenance across various economic, social, political, and effective pathways, I think really exposes the persistent problems and contradictions in the organization of economic and intimate life, and foregrounds how labors and modes of being associated with sustaining life can offer joyful, collective, meaningful, and life-affirming ways of being and doing in a world of multiple crises. So food, of course, is, so sort of quotidian, such a necessary component in the sustenance and reproduction of life. Those who grow, harvest, prepare, and work with food are such critically important actors. Yet we know that it's precisely these workers and unremunerated reproductive laborers who often remain invisible, marginalized, under, or unpaid, and precarious, even as their role in sustaining households, communities, and economies is lauded as essential, as in the pandemic. And I think we all hoped for a kind of, turn towards this essential work as, you know, getting the value and the recognition it deserves. And I feel that didn't happen in the ways that we had hoped. But examining a kind of, aspect of everyday life like food, I think allows us to really probe the persistent global gendered and racialized division of reproductive labor, the possibilities for its undoing, and new paradigms for sustaining life. Most recently, I've explored food in the context of the last many, many years, several years, decade of protest in Iran, where the very conditions that make life sustainable have been eroded by the increasing economic precarization of everyday life, coupled with state violence, the most brutal of which we saw in December, and repression from a patriarchal authoritarian state and crippling sanctions regimes. In a protest in the summer of 22, which was, a kind of summer of a lot of protests that eventually kind of led to the Women Life Freedom protests several months later, pensioners sat on the street lining a sofre, which has multiple meanings, but it's a tablecloth or a spread of food. It's often placed on the ground inside of homes or outside as well. when Iranians are dining. So they sat on the street lining an empty sofre, right? Just a piece of material as if waiting for a big communal meal. Our table is empty, they repeatedly shout. Another protest later that summer, one protester asked the police cracking down on the protesters, don't you guys use cooking oil or chicken? Don't you buy sugar or rice? Don't you eat anything? So here, food marks a material form of power, as everyone must eat. Yes, yet fewer and fewer are able to afford food and other basic necessities. An empty sofre reveals how the essential items, bodies, and workers associated with growing, procuring, preparing, and consuming food are a force for political possibility on local, national, and global scales. Flag me when it's my 5 minutes. Okay, so I think you've asked a really key question of the panel. What are the possibilities for finding collective sustenance and building nourishing relations in this disturbed landscape? And I wonder if we can, I'm really, again, really interested as a feminist scholar in the kind of ongoing crisis of reproductive labor, the failure to resolve the crisis. And I wonder if we can look to the many essential spaces and sectors organized around reproductive labor like food, and other life-sustaining practices, as the sort of, commanding heights in a world in deep crisis. How do the farmers, the teachers, the pensioners, and everyday people leading protests against hunger, economic warfare, drying riverbeds, climate crises, brutal state violence, attacks on life itself, from Iran to the US, from India to France. How do these many gendered embodied beings give us a glimpse of another world, one with an economy and way of life built around nurturing and care? I think these contemporary overlapping crises produced by capitalism, patriarchal authoritarianism, war, colonialism put the question of sustenance and life at the center of resistance and collective organizing. And the conference so beautifully has laid that out. So, might our collective engagement with the sort of basics of life, food, water, and other modes and means of sustaining life at the nexus of care and labor, in Sylvia Federici's words, re-enchant the world. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. You've just added another question for us to discuss. I'll turn it over to Vetri.
Thank you very much. And thank you. I am so honored to be invited to this panel, and also in company of two very interesting panelists, which I look forward to, conversing with after these 5 minutes. And thank you, Dana, for that kind introduction and framing. I wanted to quickly mention this lab that I have is really looking at this question of sustenance. It essentially sees sustenance as a collective issue. It's unless it's an autophagic process and we're eating ourselves, it is always collective. Although we might fail to recognize it. So it's almost, a redundant word, right? We should consider sustenance as collective. And I'm glad the emphasis is on the collective in the theme of the conference because it brings to the foreground. The other thing I think my lab tries to do is really go down to that master narrative that lies. I must say also, as myself, being a humanities professor, I'm an Italianist by trade, and most of my work was looking at migrations in the Mediterranean. But I had a zoology background in my undergraduate life that then, things that get repressed come out later in strange ways. And they did come in this kind of midlife crisis, maybe that I am. And at this 45 years old, I'm thinking of the word human and the humanities. And I was finding that deeply problematic, increasingly. I am a father to four wonderful Siberian Huskies, and having a multi-species family also, I think personally, gave me 10 years of experience of understanding how deep and how complex their culture is. So this foundational master narrative that divides of human exceptionalism found very problematic. It's kind of embedded, unsaid in the word humanities. And rather than this being a provocation, I see it as an invitation for us to consider in this moment of polycrises as to where the humanities might go. In the moment in which the value of being human is being taken away by automation. And the solution, I think, or a good pathway, one out of many probably, is what I call a multi-species paradigm shift. Um, and this connects a lot to our theme of sustenance because unless we're cannibals, the cannibal meatball that started the conference, I think, is very interesting. Unless we're cannibals, food is a multi-species relationship. It's not often understood as such. We don't think of it as such, but it absolutely is one. And it's not often studied as such in food studies as a field. So I do have an article that I'm currently writing that really talks about this. And I have a small thought exercise that I put that begins and frames the article, which I'd like to preview if all of you will indulge me in this. It's a 3-minute exercise. So I'd ask you to close your eyes and think of one memorable meal that you've had recently, something that really sustained you effectively, sustained you physically, sustained you as part of a collective, as part of a society. If I'll give you a few seconds to kind of go through your archive mentally and find one meal that you particularly find memorable. And I hope you found one. It might be even a small meal, it could be a large meal. There really is wide open. And I want you to zoom in your memories, in your archive, at the details of that moment. You can maybe think about who was there with you, the kinds of people that surrounded you. This could be a meal you had by yourself, and yet um, that can be a data point as well. Well, this was an experience that you were having of relating to yourself in a different way. But typically, I would imagine this has other people involved. Even if it was a meal at a restaurant, you had servers, you had other people surrounding. There were sounds, there were tastes involved. I'd like you to think about with the different senses of what you remember, what you recall. I'd like you to think about the people now a little bit more, conversations perhaps, as you were having that meal. What relationships did you have with these people? Were they kin? Were they family? Were they odd kin? People you might not consider as blood relations, but you have some kind of kinship with them? Were they a power relationship that was of a server versus a customer? Um, what kind of conversations did you have? Was there laughter? Was there silence? Um, I'd like to now have you, as you think of this kind of ambiance that surrounds the food, you're thinking about the social ambiance, um, to now kind of zoom in a little bit more into the dish itself. You can choose one dish out of the meals, and if you can pick that one dish and consider its taste, textures, flavor, principles, manipulative techniques that were brought into the creation of that meal. It might be simple as a salad or as complex as a slow cooked meal that took hours to make. And you're thinking of those manipulative techniques, flavor principles. You're also maybe now thinking of the traditions that this particular meal, the flavor principles come through. Maybe it's nouvelle cuisine, maybe it's something very innovative, Or maybe it's something that has been passed down through the generations as an artifact of tradition. I'd like you to now pick apart a little bit some of the ingredients in that meal. You're zooming in further. If you can think about what were the different ingredients, they might be spices. It might be as simple as salt or pepper. It might be a vegetable body or an animal body. And I'd like you to zoom in now into thinking about the life form, that ingredient when it was alive, that life form that it had. Can you think of what a pepper plant looks like if you found pepper? Can you think of, if you're thinking of salt, you can think of where that salt came from. Was it rock salt? Was it part of the sea? But I'd like you to more think about animate parts of your meal. Was it a plant? Was it, I don't know, a potato, a zucchini? Or if there was an animal, was it a cow? Was it a chicken? Was it a fish? And as you zoom in, the last thing I'd like you to consider is the different relationships that that life form might have had. Was it sentient? Was it intelligent? Do we attribute sentience, intelligence, affect to that creature, whatever that was, a plant form, a fungal form? If it was mushrooms, probably animal. Did it have relationships of its own? Perhaps if it was a plant, did it have an underground root network that connected it to other plants around it? Maybe it had earthworm kin that were helping the soil become nutritious for its life. If it was an animal, did it have siblings, a family, friends? Just have you consider the life of that of that sustaining matter that's on your dish. Okay, and now you can zoom out from that, come back to the dish itself, come back to your surroundings, that meal, and the beautiful taste that it had. Okay, well, thank you very much. And I will leave it at that. I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss, but I'd love to, if in the chat feature people want to share, maybe just the meal or the dish type that they thought about. It'll be great to see the variety. Um, and I thought of my grandmother's goat curry. It's kind of a go-to. Um, so if you want to, in the chat feature, any participants share the dish, so we can maybe relate to it, at least imagine what it tastes like. That would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vetri. I was thinking of roasted vegetables with tahini sauce, and I realized I know nothing about the relationships around sesame seeds. Like, I don't even know what the plant looks like. So interesting when you realize the holes, you know? Like, yeah, thank you for that. I'll turn it over to Paulina.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to the conference organizers, participants from previous panels, and the audience who's here joining us now. I was thinking about a dumpling making party I actually hosted last weekend in kind of prep for a Lunar New Year, which is this coming week. Wonderful exercise. Thank you. I'm love this question that you all have put together for this panel. What are the possibilities of finding collective sustenance and building nourishing relations in this disturbed landscape? And I'm approaching my answer to it through my work on the edible insect industry in the United States. It's an industry that emerged in the 2010s in response to the devastations already wrought by dominant modes of industrial agriculture and the specter of crises to come if we're to continue producing and consuming
food in those ways. So initially, my research was focused on different kinds of sustainability-minded capitalist actors, so agri-food tech entrepreneurs, small-scale farmers, chefs, educators, and policymakers who saw promise in insects as a food of the future and who were trying to develop them, specifically crickets, as an alternative protein, a potential replacement for industrially raised, resource-intensive, and heavily polluting grain-fed meat. But through my fieldwork and the relationships and networks I formed while working with small-scale cricket farmers in Iowa, I was introduced to a family who has been foraging for grasshoppers in and around Des Moines in central Iowa since they were relocated there in the 1970s. My time spent getting to know and foraging with this family, learning from them and laughing with them and eating with them, radically shifted how I approached my project. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my fieldwork and about Hong, one of my primary interlocutors, as a way of offering sharing, intimate history, and listening for feeling as methods that I think can help build nourishing relations and point us towards collective sustenance. So the first time we ever spoke on the phone, Hong wanted to know, are you Chinese? My last name, Liu, had made her suspect as much. I told her yes, half Chinese, half Korean too. And she was confused at first, but satisfied when I explained that my father was born in Hong Kong after my parents fled southern China, or my grandparents fled southern China. My mother's parents came to the US from Korea at the end of Japanese occupation and then had gotten stuck here when the Korean War broke out. That my own parents had met in California in the 80s. Okay, she said, and you want to know about eating crickets for your school project? To this too, I answered yes, explaining my project about edible insects and how the research I had conducted about cricket farming labor by working for Shelby Smith at Jiminy Crickets had led me to her. Okay, you be good, study hard, make your parents proud, she said, chiding me like an auntie. Hong is in her mid-60s, which is close to my mother's age. She doesn't have any children of her own, but she has 10 siblings and is auntie to many. Over the months we spent together, she treated me like her nieces and nephews, always wanting to feed me, pose for pictures with me, asking after my schoolwork, and insisting that I text her to let her know I made it home. I share this to explain the nature of our relationship, the intimacy of it, shaped by age, gender, and the navigation of the similarities and differences of our Asianness and our different relationships to immigration and war, which was crucial to the way I entered the field and participated in Hong's grasshopper harvest. In the process of getting to know each other, Hong folded me into the frenzied circulation of foods procured, prepared, and given that she maintains with family and friends. The first time I went to her house, she sent me home with a bowl full of blackberries that we had picked together from her backyard garden. The next time we saw each other, I brought her a gift of live crickets. I had gone to visit Shelby, and she had let me take some live crickets from the cricket barn, though she hadn't sold them to Hong in years. Hong showed me how to kill, clean, and cook the crickets, and that day we ate them with her mom for lunch. I remember Hong's expression of deep pleasure upon popping a cricket into her mouth straight from the wok of hot oil. She said, I haven't gotten to taste this in a long time. This embodied activation of her memory is now a memory of mine. Hong sent me home with pungent dried fish that her sister, number 6, had caught, and a bag of tart little crab apples from the overflowing tree in her front yard. Her older sister, Mai, number 2, started texting me asking for tips about how to make kimchi, and I told her everything I had learned from my Halmoni, my Korean grandmother, and from my Auntie Helen, both of whom, in many different ways, reminded me of so much. Hong choked up the first time that she told me that when her family arrived in Iowa, unlike the rest of her siblings, she hadn't gotten to go to school. I was too dumb, she said, wiping at tears. Instead, she had worked first as a dishwasher, then in food service, and eventually as a cleaner in a government building in Des Moines. But Maya tells me that Hong's history of work and the role she took up serving as her parents' caretaker are the reason she knows more about picking grasshoppers than anyone else in their generation. Maya's recently retired from her job as a teacher in the Des Moines public school system, and while telling me about her own experiences collecting grasshoppers, she tacks on the phrase, Hong would know, to many of her explanations. You find them on certain trees. Hong would know. We used to go in certain seasons. I don't remember, but Hong would know. Mai explains that Hong knows so much about grasshoppers because of time spent with their parents. For Hong, perhaps not being able to go to school was the missed chance to pursue the kinds of independent and upwardly mobile lives that some of her siblings enjoy, free from the daily burdens and joys of living with and taking care of their parents. But in Mai's telling, this loss is also the condition of possibility for Hong's deep knowledge of grasshoppers. So, in sharing these small moments from my fieldwork, I want to draw attention to three things. First, to the circulation and exchange of foods and food knowledge that helped bond us to each other. So, the blackberries, crab apples, fish, crickets, and kimchi chips, which point us towards abundance and to reciprocity and to what the gardener and poet Rothgay simply calls the practice of sharing, which healthy living systems model for us. Second, I want to point out that the closeness of my relationship to Hong emerged from sharing intimate histories of who we are and how we came to be, as those personal stories unfolded within larger structural and historical forces. So this process formed the basis of a thick relationship that allowed me to notice what Hong was showing me, that the past is always present, and that staying with the trouble is not a choice, but a condition of living. Hong's relationship to grasshoppers offers a model of what sustenance looks like in a context shaped by damage already done, one that responds to the end of the world by carrying on, inventing, and insisting on continuity in the present and into the future. This is a model not only of staying with the trouble, but of living in it, and of finding moments of pleasure in its weeds, in this case, quite literally. The third and final point I want to make is that spending time with Hong and coming to understand her complex relationship with grasshoppers helped me recognize an effective through line across all my field sites. Throughout my research, the topic of edible insects did not simply open up conversations about the material realities of our food systems and of climate change. It became an occasion for people to articulate anxiety about the future and about what they feared losing or had already lost. The pleasures and meanings of eating meat, humanity's capacity to feed itself, the identity of being a farmer, and the ability to live as their parents had or to provide a good life for their children. People turned to insects and tried to make them into food in response to these losses and anticipated losses. So, spoiler alert, at this point, efforts to produce and promote insects for human consumption in the United States have largely failed. But I think listening for feeling helps us make sense of this failure and learn from it. In this context, attending to affect offers a way into unlearning attachments to dreams of capitalist expansion and human domination that do not serve us, by instead helping us to tune into our more basic and shared desires, to live in health and connection, and to eat food that brings pleasure. So we live in a world of many worlds, and though they are incommensurate, I think that listening for feeling invites us to recognize what they nevertheless share in common, which is the place I think where we might begin to build collective sustenance.
Thank you so much. I'm thinking maybe, just to draw on your last comment, Paulina, maybe I can ask you all to unspool and think about affect, since that's where we've arrived through all of these incredibly rich reflections that you've just offered. And maybe ask Vetri and Catherine to respond and to talk through how you conceive of affects, fear, loss, love, desire in relation to food and sustenance. Vetri, do you want to start us off?
Sure. That was very fascinating, Paulina. And of course, Catherine, I really loved some of your comments about, the failure to resolve crises. I think it's very important, and I find myself being terribly restless um, at perhaps, kind of reevaluating what and coordinating accordingly, strategizing based on, that I think we can declare failure of the inability to resolve crises, despite the spread of, so many alternatives that have been proposed. So, I think affect is very promising, and it's no wonder that someone who's interested in a multi-species paradigm shift would connect to affect, because it is one pathway that possibly takes us out of, the whole meaning making that we're so addicted to and interested in, and really focus on as humans. We look at meaning making and story making, but affect is pre-meaning. If we really look at the definition, and it's something that has the force and has that physical impact almost, right? That kind of contact that we have just being in the presence of each other and besides each other, and that kind of sustenance that we get by just the ontological reality of being. So I think there's something very powerful in sustenance that is connected to presence. And I think if we can acknowledge presence and we start to acknowledge labor as well, the invisibilized labor of that goes into the production of that sustenance as well. So I think there seems to be a lot of promise. At least this is kind of my instinct.
Let's see, I was going to start somewhere else, but then I just remembered the four friends slash colleagues, but friends um, who I've been thinking with food with and eating food always. We were all obsessed with food. We we wrote a piece together for feminist studies, but before that, we presented um, our, sort of ethnographic work at the National Women's Studies Conference in 20, I have to remember, um, 20, 2022, I believe it was. Oh, yeah, it was 2022. We were slotted for an 8 a.m. Panel on sort of, you know, food diaspora. I can't remember the name of our panel, but we were like, well, no one's going to be there. It's at 8 a.m. It's on food. And it was packed, absolutely packed. And the reason I'm just telling the story is because we in talking about our sort of transnational families, food, longing, the kind of, each of us sort of, narrating a kind of experience with food and what that has meant to us and to our families. Um, People were incredibly emotional, and we were just very surprised by this. And I think we sort of talked about it and debriefed and said, part of it is that particularly for feminists and women, food has been such a fraught, you know, um, uh, subject, right? So much tied to um, reproductive labor, something that feminists, I think, have felt that they couldn't talk about or needed to reject in a certain way, the kind of rejection of the feminine, right? And feminine kind of life worlds. I mean, not all feminists, obviously, but anyway, but that it was like a kind of fraught and topic. So after our panel and just realizing like it sort of opened this kind of collective floodgate in a certain way for acknowledging how powerful how powerful food memories are, relations of food, tied to both exploitation and, labor, but also love and care and longing and separation from family and sort of all of this stuff. So I think the effective is very much there. And I've thought a lot about this in relationship to my father, who is an immigrant from Iran and who I really learned about food and care from him more than my mother. For my mother, food was, as a, working class American, she felt very burdened by food preparation. And she let us know that. Whereas my father, for him, because he wasn't doing all the preparing of food, but he had a very different relationship to food. And so a kind of nurturing masculinity, I think, is really in there for me with him and his own mother when he left Iran. One of the ways in which she expressed her sort of sadness and anxiety about that separation was he going to be able to get the food that he had had in Iran? So those are some initial thoughts about affect.
Thank you. Paulina, would you like to add in?
Yeah, I think I want to talk about food and memory a little bit, and Catherine, maybe a little bit more about your essay, which I really enjoyed reading about your father. The way you describe his fuss over and delight in preparing food for others, like reminded me so much of my own dad. And when I'm thinking too, when we're talking about food and memory about Vetri, this action you just had us do earlier in the session of kind of activating our own memories, and really inhabiting them and kind of navigating through them in different ways, focusing on different points and the people and the objects in front of us and maybe their histories. But Catherine, you note in that essay about the daily acts of that many immigrants do of tending gardens and preserving food and feeding the people around them, that they don't actually reconfigure the gender division of reproductive labor on a global scale. Yet they are forms of care and nourishment that still participate in this kind of refusal of dispossession. So I'm asking this question because it's something I'm grappling with in my own work too, and wondering how you, but everyone here today is thinking about the relationship between scale and political transformation. So at what point, if at all, do these quotidian practices accumulate into or not into larger kinds of changes?
That's a great question. I think we should go with it. And actually I mean, there's a phrase, Catherine, in your piece in that article that you referenced just now in your opening remarks, around food as portal from the intimate to the socio-political and back. The and back is interesting, I think. Um, and I would be interested to ask all of you, I mean, to repeat, sort of amplify Paulina's question, to think about scale, distance, presence, and absence in your work, or really anything else that kind of framing inspires in you. I don't know who would want to take that on. Go for it, Petri.
Um, Paulina, those were really important comments. And Dana, thanks for speaking about this idea of the portal that was brought up. I think it's really interesting to think of scale by thinking about, firstly, I think attentiveness and what that might mean, because I think my exercise for myself was useful in zooming into things that I might not be attentive to. And so a lot of this new kind of newer field of multi-species studies is about the practicing the art of attentiveness. I'm quoting from a really wonderful book chapter, which I'll put in the chat, that says, this is kind of what we're doing, because it of course goes beyond the verbal, and so you kind of have a choice of curating your memories, or you're producing memories, you're curating your experience, you're zooming into different scales. You might go down to an ingredient, but you might then be able to zoom out. And then your comment of not being able to visualize what a sesame plant looks like, right? We can zoom into specific ingredients, but how interesting would it be to zoom and scale up our attentiveness to looking at, well, what does the complete life form actually look like? But that's just the first step, because I think that kind of multi-species attentiveness allows us to then zoom out to scale and look at, what did the farm look like? Was this intensive agriculture? Was it a small farm? What were the power dynamics of the workers versus who owned the farm? What was the higher scale economy, or the economic ideology, behind that arrangement? And so I feel visualization, attentiveness and visualization are key to food becoming then truly a portal into understanding these interconnections, if that makes sense.
I have no answers. Because I mean, I am I we do need to grapple with what is the scale, right? Because I think I mean, collective care, I think, is a theme that's resonant. And I think for me, that kind of registers between the state and the sort of individual, right? That there's something there we need something more than individual households or even sort of, the networks that we're all building to survive. But I mean, this is a longer discussion and could be a whole panel. We probably do need some form of the state on the way to whatever alternative we're seeking. But, sort of in on that path, how do we build collective care um, that is big enough to relieve some of the burden of, right, reproducing ourselves and others that is shared, like the burden shared, and also in the sharing of the burden is the joy in the world making. And it's so hard here. It's just really, really hard here. We, probably many of us have experiences of trying to build alternative kinship and more collective ways of being, but you're doing that in a larger context of everything working against that, and the pressures to figure it out on your own, and, sort of neoliberalism gone, just in horrendous directions. So I think that I am really interested in thinking about that with others. I mean, I don't know if people have read Veronica Gago's work, Feminist International, where she talks a lot about the sort of, I mean, she's Argentinian, and Argentina has like a huge, 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 strong labor movement. And she's talking about women's strikes in 2017 and 2018. And she's really talking about, like, who could participate in them, and when women who are responsible for caring for households and communities couldn't participate, the kind of crisis that brought to the forefront. So she has all this beautiful language, but one of the things she talks about is like taking the kitchen into the street, right? The contradiction, the fact that there is no separation between the private and the public, like, is revealed at that moment, and that, everything becomes part of the collective. And so it's a way, I think, of thinking about what are those spaces. And I think we have these beautiful models of mutual aid. I think, that's another kind of key term, the ways in which people have thought about how to not just survive, but, build, prefigure the ways in which we want to be more collective. And but even that feels a little bit to me like it's still at, a smaller scale, and we want even something larger. So what does that look like? And, I mean, it's very easy to get romantic about it. Like, we're all going to go back to some, everyone's raising their own food. I'm not sure everyone wants to raise their own food. Is that even what we want to, what we want to do? So I don't know. I just, I think these are such hard questions. Premalin Nadson has this amazing book, Care of the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and she talks about how, well, we do sort of have a care economy, but it's like it's even, massively worsened the exploitation of women of color who are, and other precarious workers who are now, doing all of these kinds of reproductive labor jobs. And we have somehow have a national narrative that says care work is important, but we have an economy in which the kind of elevation of care as a key term has hidden the labor of it, and that the labor part of it is still deeply exploitative. So anyway, that's a long ramble to say that I think scale is such a key question, and I maybe people have ideas about, how to scale up that collectivity of the reproduction of everyday life, particularly when, there are, we don't, the abundance, and the deprivation is unequally distributed.
Paulina, if you have something to add, I want to follow up on that. I think the question of also visualizing scale comes down to, um, I think, a good 30, 40 years of um, higher education in general not doing enough public humanities and not being supported in general, to do more public humanities too, because this visualization has to be learned. And it's done in some communities. I'm thinking first and foremost of indigenous communities who have been talking about these matters for millennia, but have been ignored, or not been, mainstreamed at all in normative education. I mean, how many? I'm now saying, okay, this is going to be. I'm going to cite indigenous scholars as much as possible because they're just not, the citations aren't there. So there's that part. But I'm also thinking of that kind of town gown divide and how much uh, I think missed chances in the have been there in I think for decades, in which the public might not necessarily understand the important work that's being done completely, and that visualization and that scale is therefore not something that's that's really reflected upon. Even a small meditative thought exercise kind of puts, and I'm trying to find my way here too, and trying to understand how can I get away from jargon and how can I help, my mom, my friend whom I'm chatting with understand what I'm doing and what work I'm doing, and making these kinds of connections of scale, of complexity, but explaining it not by talking down, but by really finding interesting, exciting ways of communicating. And I really encourage all students, undergraduate, graduate, high school students to, can you explain what you just said in a simpler way, like in a direct way, in a way that really affects us and kind of impinges on us very effectively as well. And it's something that I'm very passionate about, and my lab is kind of trying to figure out ways of doing that and communicating that. Paulina, I was really curious to know actually, what kind of uh, a relationship do you have with insects and with this alternative food through your research? And what has this trajectory been in? Was this initially an unfamiliar food, which then you developed some form of care and kinship with in a different way? I'm very curious to know in terms of your positionality as a researcher, but also as someone who is eating what they're researching.
I am not always eating what I am researching, though I have, that does happen sometimes. And to answer your question directly, I didn't have a relationship with insects as food before I started this research. I came to it as many folks did, kind of in the mid to late 2010s. Insects, edible insects were all over the news as a food of the future. And one of the anecdotes I tell in my dissertation is actually about the first time I encountered them, which were on the street in New York City in this food truck that's like blasting this advertisement offering passersby to like get a chance to taste the future in food. And one of like through eating insects. And I think what was striking to me at the time, I see it on the street and then I also start reading it in news everywhere. And there's this article, I'm going to try and find the exact title of it. It came out in the New York Times and it's called, on October 7th, 2018. And it's called Why Aren't We Eating More Insects? They're high in protein, low in cost, and eco-friendly, and only in the West have we resisted them. So at the time when I came across that news article and was seeing it all over the news and in the street and on menus, I was in coursework and curious about and thinking about embodiment and the role of food in histories of empire and in processes of racialization and stories of migration. And I was also thinking about the concept of taste as a simultaneously like intimate and public experience, and a set of cultural values and an acquired sensorial capacity that linked bodies in different geographies. So and as a means of like marking social difference. So nestled in the subheading of this article, there were bodies and environments like high in protein, the economy, low in cost, and the environment, like the idea of being eco-friendly, and power dynamics born from histories of imperialism and colonialism, taking the form of a present in the problem of taste, like only in the West have we resisted them. So I was kind of fascinated by this how the prospect of eating insects pulled all these different things together. And that's kind of where it started for me. And I can talk to at length about the kind of journey of anxieties I had in conversation with my graduate advisor about my, attachment and detachment from the topic. And what felt close to me and what didn't, some of these, and kind of what it's like to circle back to these questions that are more meaningful to me around kind of taste and colonialism and history that are kind of like I said in the beginning of my introduction to the project, it kind of departed from there into study with folks who were actually building systems of producing insects on a larger scale. And that's not where I thought it was going to go. But I kind of started in these realms of consumption and taste making, and then traced these lines back to sites of production. And that's where it was happening in these like giant industrial agri-food tech centers, and also in these networks of small farmers. So it's been really a circular journey back for me.
That's awesome. Okay, I am jumping up and down because I'm like, I keep thinking about this phrase that Vetri you use in the piece that I linked in the chat. Thinking about acculturation. It seems so resonant to me in your all of your last comments. And there's this one phrase that you use, Vetri, to describe people and other species, plants, all beings who are brought into existence by the draining of Italian marshlands for agro-industry in the 1930s in Italy. You call this mono-acculturated fascistic citizens, which I just feel like, okay, you're describing 1930s Italy, but I'm feeling like we're now living in a world of mono-acculturated fascistic citizens. And just thinking through the framing that you provide of acculturation to sort of work through some of the issues that you all are describing here. So I wanted just to throw that out to you all as like a, free associate with mono-acculturated fascistic citizens. And in particular, thinking about how plants, animals, insects, people are cultured or acculturated. What does it mean to become mono-acculturated? What would the alternative be? Poly-acculturated, maybe? And how living beings, citizens, laborers are acculturated through food production and consumption. So maybe I think that will be my last sort of invitation to you all to reflect and bring in whatever it is that you would like at this point in your answer to that question. And then hopefully at the end of that, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. Do you want to start us off, Vetri, since I'm quoting your piece?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. And I was specifically referring to, the Mussolini's fascist regime. They were in this area of Agropontino between Rome and Naples that has been considered since ancient Roman times, at the least, as a problematic location because in anthropocentric terms, it's not productive. It is a wetland. It's a wetland. It's kind of unique in a lot of Italy, that area, because it's not an estuary. It's just a place where the rivers come and disappear into this what is called an ecotonic zone where land and water, it's unclear. It's a transition zone. And hence, it can't be made agriculturally productive very easily. But Mussolini was able to do that in the 1920s and 30s in what he called the Battaglia per il Grano, the battle for grain. So he was looking at making Italy self-sufficient in sustenance, self-sustaining. And it's a very interesting moment in which I see here In my forthcoming book, I hope you guys will read it. It's open access, but also available in print. It's going to come out in the fall. And the idea is my definition of colonialism is a multi-species one. I realized that the British didn't come to my native country, India, in search of humans. They came in search of spices. They came in search of some very multi-species bodies that were very lucrative. And then, of course, the humans and then the labor were were additional opportunities for extraction and exploitation. But so my definition of colonialism, I repropose a new definition, which is the capture and control of multi-species bodies, lives, and ecosystems. And so when it comes to a monoculture, this is something that you will find surprisingly links in all forms of authoritative governments and all ends of the ideological political spectrum, from left to right. You'll find when it isn't something that is of smaller scale, which reverts to maybe democracies on a smaller scale, you have this flattening. You have the use of monocultural crops, genetically modified. They're all might be clones. And you kind of can think of it metaphorically as very much, the cloning, the cultural cloning of citizens in order for them to comply with one very narrowly focused set of ways of worldviews, really, if we think of. So the natural is deeply connected to the cultural, and the cultural is deeply connected to the natural, and that's what I was trying to tease out a little bit in my work. And so I'm really glad for this question of acculturation, which I absolutely see relevant to Catherine's work. Which is also super interesting for me in Paulina's work because the acculturation aspect is very important in because taste is paired with disgust, and insects provoke, in certain acculturated societies, disgust, right? We're thinking, oh, we're eating an insect, whereas it can be a delicacy in other cultural contexts. So I think it's really interesting and resonates with both my fellow panelists' works. Maybe
Catherine,
Catherine or
Paulina,
Paulina, you can say
which
something
one of you
about,
would
yeah.
be interested in
Yeah, I'd
taking
love to
this up?
know. Yeah, especially, Catherine, your work on this question of scale, this question of the inability to resolve, like how much has that got to do with um, some form of, cultural diversity, and also connected to this question of gender and labor that I think is really the thread of gender runs through a lot of these questions, I feel.
I mean, I'm having a hard time forming uh, any cohesive thoughts. I mean, I was actually thinking of maybe this isn't helpful, but also what happens when there is a kind of multicultural embrace of food that is run simultaneous to a kind of, objectification, dismissal, violence towards the other, right? But not the other's food. I mean, so that's probably not helpful for this question of acculturation, but it's Iranian, many people would say, Iranian food, and you know, here in Orange County, there's an incredible grocery that's like started by Iranians, and it has this Iranian bread oven, and it's a really actually such a fascinating place because the workforce is Latino, Persian, primarily, and um, so it's a kind of site of some kind of cultural exchange on the one hand. But anyway, I digress. I mean, on the other hand, I think probably people know a lot more about Iranian food and Iranian film than how to think about what's going on there sort of politically right now. I don't know, maybe that's unfair, but I guess what happens when sort of, when we think about food as as a kind of innocent celebratory kind of marker of some kind of diversity, and kind of don't connect it to these histories I think that we're all really interested in exploring. So I don't know if that's very helpful, but I'm also really interested in that too, like how does that happen, and you know on the one hand, it's, I think, culture and food culture is a place for so much potential humanizing of the other, I mean, even bell hooks eating the other. Um, on the other hand, without a kind of larger context of, what are the kind of larger political histories of these regions and in relationship to colonialism and cultural imperialism and migration. So I doubt that that's very helpful or directly responding to the question, but those are some initial thoughts.
I actually think it's a really great bridge to turn to Paulina, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, I hear. I also think, like, as what you've just said, about cultural consumption and kind of where it rubs up against cultural appropriation. But actually, when in answering this question, I want to talk about production, which is another, just the other side of it. And Danny asked, how are citizens, laborers, and living beings acculturated through food production and consumption? So when I think about acculturation, I think of processes of becoming and processes of becoming disciplined, in the Foucauldian sense of how power dynamics work through bodies and are, get taken up in embodied forms. And what I'm thinking about in the context of my own research is the time I spent working every day in a food production site, in this one room cricket barn in central Iowa, where crickets were being raised as a monocrop, inside plastic storage containers that were filled with cardboard egg flats and stacked up on these metal shelving racks. And inside the cricket barn, which is, it's kept close to as possible to 87 degrees Fahrenheit and above 65% humidity all the time. And my labor inside of it looked like climbing up and down a step ladder and giving them food, and water, and also doing a lot of cleaning. Routinely, I was using an industrial vacuum cleaner to suck up the spiders that hung from the walls and ceilings. And this is the kind of quotidian killing that anthropologist Sarah Beskey has described as the labor of maintaining monoculture, the process of working over and over again towards homogeneity, but never quite achieving it. So when I'm thinking about being acculturation, being acculturated in monoculture, I'm remembering how the daily labor inside the cricket barn fundamentally changed me. And get fundamentally changed the musculature of my body in a very physical sense. My right shoulder and arm got huge, from a very specific kind of repetitive movement. And it changed my senses and sensorium too, as I became desensitized to certain kinds of smells and hyper attuned to other sounds and smells. And my feelings changed as well, as the kind of repetitive labor I was doing numbed and conditioned me into what I call sensing like a cricket capitalist, which is a certain kind of paying attention, as Vedri said, of certain kind of noticing and of relating to crickets, that was simultaneously paying attention to them and also not caring about them at all. Like that is just what that kind of work structures and necessitates and helps and produces. So laboring within capitalist food systems not only restructures our bodies, kind of materially, muscularly, physiologically, and our senses, but our capacity for feeling, and for the way that we relate to other beings and all the other beings that make up our multi-species worlds.
That is fantastic. Thank you, Paulina. I'm just thrilled. I'm so excited. I mean, the responses to that question were so fascinating from all three of you. We have just enough time. We have 15 minutes for questions, comments, thoughts. I see that there's a comment slash question in the chat that I think is mainly oriented toward Catherine. I'm from Catherine Wells. Much of my knowledge of Iranian politics has ironically come through film, though. There's a question to how film or food can orient us, perhaps effectively, to real issues. And indeed, how does this matter when we're considering scale?
It totally matters. I was trying to write, but I never became a really good like write and listen, multitasker on the Zoom. So I'm glad that we have a little time. I mean, I truly did not mean to discount the ways in which I think culture, film, food, art, those are for me, those are real life issues and I think really important places to look at how they reflect and also influence, social movements, everyday acts of protest. That that has been really important. And in Iran, with the most recent protests of the last, 4 years, the sort of culture of the space of the protest has been a really beautiful one, particularly in Women Life Freedom, when there was so much music and so much dancing, and the kind of preparation of food. Again, bringing the sort of you know body into space in a new way, and in doing that, kind of crossing a certain threshold of fear and of possibility. So I think that kind of the actually the culture of political protest and resistance, I think, is really important. And the huge farmers marches and rallies and strikes and protests in India were so incredible to watch. I mean, and food preparation as, a big part of that, the sharing of food and the feeding people, and, and in Minnesota too. I mean, so anyway, that I really do think that, you know, there's a rich culture of film in Iran as a place to reflect and also move conversations around real issues. So I don't think it's actually separate from, politics or everyday life. I think all of those things are really, really important. And, there's a weird way in which, because of its everydayness and quotidianness, like food we can, there is a way in which it can be sort of, you know, um, emptied of meaning through, through various political forces and through various ways in which it's structured and organized. But I think it is full of meaning, and can be a place for people connecting to the other and to places that they don't know about. So yeah, so I'm glad you raised that, Catherine.
I wondered if maybe we can expand that question out, because I know that Vetri and I think Paulina, you as well, are both interested in these questions around media and the mediatization of sustenance. If you have any associations or thoughts to add into that sort of dilemma of sort of the consumption of media, um, and how, what I guess how one fits this in terms of scale, in terms of experience, and in terms of politics, with the broader issues that we've been discussing.
Very quickly, I do think that ultimately, how we eat is a question of, it comes down to meaning making. And um, it's really a question that is where this meaning then becomes embodied into the physical sustenance that then we take into our bodies. So the question of how that meaning is made, it can be done through so many ways. Catherine mentioned, the meaning making created through film, created through so many relationships ultimately, and so I absolutely think it's this wonderful way, and I think food studies has not been given until now the just space that it deserves within departments. I hope that this will be an invitation for people to hire, people to teach more food studies courses and allow their doctoral students to safely work in food studies and it not be kind of a side thing and a lesser subject. Because I really think that it is this incredible way in which it is a vector for culture. And so anyone working on cultural studies should absolutely find food as an absolutely fascinating and very complex subject in which meaning connects to matter and matter connects to meaning deeply, very deeply, very intimately, but also on vast, vast scales on a planetary level. So it really goes down to from the cellular level of what's happening in our gut microbiomes to what's happening on our vast ecosystems that cover the earth. So really the possibilities are limitless and there needs to be so much more scholarship, so much more teaching, and the students are extremely receptive. So this really is an invitation to graduate students, since this is a graduate student conference, to not be afraid of choosing it as a dissertation topic and making and becoming a scholar in food and cultural studies.
Paulina, do you have any thoughts on this?
I do, yeah. Just on the topic of media and mediation and messaging, what it made me think about were not just the kind of the news articles I mentioned in a previous response about how to Vetri's question about how I got interested in the topic, but also kind of the documentaries and other forms of media that have surrounded the insect agriculture movement and the edible insect movement in the United States. And one of the main messages has been like insects are going to feed the world. And as I mentioned, right, as of now, that hasn't come true. These industries, at least here, have failed. And so one of the things that I've been doing recently is going back and interviewing folks I had talked to maybe 5 years ago, were these kind of early agri-food tech industrialists, and talking to them about their reflections. How are they feeling? What have they learned from this process of failure? And one of the things that is, I'm thinking about a conversation I had a few weeks ago with this man named Pat Crowley who started Japool, which is like the first cricket bar company in the US. He got a lot of early funding on Shark Tank, and he was saying like, I wish that when I talked about it, they wouldn't always label my TED Talk, insects are going to feed the world, because I never really thought that. And there was this kind of pressure to do this kind of messaging that was, again, to these questions of scale that we've been having, to share a narrative that this was going to scale up really, really quickly and in really, really transformative ways. And and that just hasn't happened. And I think one of the narrative arcs that's coming out of these more recent interviews is a transformation from hubris to humility around the way people are approaching food systems transformation. So kind of letting go of these dreams of, infinite and really quick scalability and frictionless, and towards kind of smaller, slower building.
Yeah, the problem with that smaller and slower is like, where's the profit, right? It's all about optimization of profit, and we go right back to that question of, how do we kind of move against those unrelenting kind of forces of, the market. And I think it's happening. It happens with the slow food movement in Italy. And that really kind of became mainstream. It connected to government practices of really protecting smaller farms and smaller, more terroir-based products. So, small producers, local produce, and then it really became part of that system of saying this is not a mutually exclusive question, that if you have small scale, really good, genetically diverse food, that can actually give you really good profits too. It's just a very different way of thinking of your relationship with the land, your relationship with with your local communities, and so there is a way to get economic benefits while also treating the land possibly well. But that requires, I think, something that is a cultural movement. And the slow food movement is a cultural movement that started when the first McDonald's was built in Italy, and it was a reaction to that founding of the first McDonald's. McDonald's is really popular in Italy, but it also allowed for the slow food movement to develop, and for the local and for the federal government, the national government, to say, hey, you know what, we should develop a system of really supporting these small scale and humble um, production of food.
That is really, I think, really resonating very strongly with how Catherine brought in the framing question for this panel in your opening thoughts about thinking about how everyday practices, small scale, individual, humble practices of producing food, eating, or even displaying the absence of food in the sofre protests provide a glimpse of other ways of being, other ways of the world making that persist under attack and that, builds. I'm not even going to go into metaphors. The seeds, we don't need that. But I think that's a really interesting sort of I feel like that comment sort of brings together a lot of the threads that we've been working through, different metaphor that we've been following and tracing over the last hour and a half, which is now actually coming to a close. It's been such a pleasure to begin this conversation. I do feel as though we could have maybe 5 separate panels, and probably still have richness and still be asking questions and still be struggling together, which is, I think, the mark of a really, really productive keynote. And also to recognize that the conversation is nourished and informed by the really fascinating presentations that have already happened this morning. And we'll continue from 3 to 4:30 for the final panel of this conference. So I just really want to encourage everyone. And in fact, if you have that handy, Bianca, to put in the chat for everyone the registration link for the 3 p.m. panel, just to be absolutely sure that you're all really motivated to join and to reflect in the final leg of this great conference. Thank you, Bianca. And thank you all so much to Catherine, Paulina, and to Vetri for offering your time and for sharing your insights this afternoon.